If an employer says, hey, I need a program today, how long does that take to get that program going? In a number of states, it can take up to a year, and that's way too long.
Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Mason Bishop, principal at Work Ed Consulting, as a guest here at AEI.
Hi, Brent.
In our Viewpoint series. Good to see you, Mason. You've been my friend and colleague for many years,
Yes.
and you recently did a paper for us here at AEI, and it's called Addressing the Employment Challenge, the Use of Post-Secondary Non-Credit Training and Skills Development. Why don't you start by giving us an overview of that topic? Tell us what non-credit training is and why you think this is an important issue.
Well, a lot of people think they have an idea of what education and training means, and given that the economy today really talks about skills training, or people need skills, or you hear about skills gaps, I really wanted to take a look at, well, how do we address those skills gaps? And the paper really looks at two sort of large chunks of post-secondary education training. The first is what most people think of as college, which is accredited programs, meaning that somebody takes a math class for 3 hours and gets college credit, or gets 4 credit hours for a biology class. The other big chunk, and really the focus of the paper, was non-credit training, which is what is happening to be able to address people's skills when they're not getting college credit. And are there new factors involved with regard to non-credit training? Is it a viable alternative to credit and quote-unquote college? Or is it something that really doesn't have the rigor of college and is falling short in terms of being able to address people's skills? So that really was the central premise and look at the paper.
So talk a little bit more then about what if I were a student and I were getting ready to go to community college, what would a non-credit program look like as compared to a credit program?
Yes, that's a great question. So first of all, we did focus on community colleges because they are a primary driver of skills training in the United States right now. Over 50% of most post-secondary students are at community colleges, and community colleges historically have played two roles and continue to play two roles. One role is that they provide the general education, 2 years education for an individual who wants to transfer and get a 4-year baccalaureate degree. The other role that a community college plays is workforce training, and that may be a 2-year associate's degree, it may be a certificate or a license or that sort of thing. And so we really wanted to look at the workforce training role of community colleges. And in doing so, historically, there have been some issues with regard to non-credit training. It's really why I wanted to look at it, because it can be criticized in the past for perhaps being some person's desire to create, you hear jokes about basket weaving classes, and sometimes it isn't that bad necessarily, but the question is, are there viable programs that teach people skills that connect directly to the labor market? So non-credit at a community college actually takes many different forms, and we didn't focus on all those different forms. We focused just on the workforce training piece. But sometimes you hear terms such as community education. Community colleges will have non-credit, learning how to do financial management or those kinds of things for community members to come in and take certain courses. We did not focus on that. We focused on specific non-credit training leading to jobs.
Right. So we're all familiar with, and you talk about this in the paper, sort of the unprecedented kind of labor market conditions that we've got right now with very low unemployment, so low in fact that it's kind of pulling people back into the market who have been out of work, and then what goes along with that are all these unfilled positions, millions of unfilled jobs right now in America. How would the increased use of non-credit training help to address that problem or those problems of both, the unfilled jobs and the skills gap?
Yeah. So Whether if you're an economist that believes in the skills gap or not, that's not really, wasn't critical to the notion of the paper. Whether the connection between those who are unemployed and those number of jobs are available, whether that's an economic problem that some economists would feel is due to some factor or another, we didn't worry about that. We just took the data as it stands today, as you mentioned, where even the unemployment rate just ticked up because more people are looking for work, able and available for work. So looking at the mismatch, so to speak, of available jobs and the number of people looking for jobs, and that's pretty well documented over the last few months and year. What we did is then ask the question, are non-credit programs a viable alternative to address that market condition? In particular, are non-credit programs potentially more market responsive to employer needs for skills and to be able to get people hired more quickly than, say, a credit based program? And that really was the central premise of what we looked at in the paper, is to see if those non-credit options could be market responsive and could be something that more quickly addresses this skills gap or this employment gap, at the minimum, being able to more quickly and rapidly connect people who are unemployed or underemployed to jobs that are available in manufacturing or in retail or IT or any number of industries.
So you say you looked at it, and what did you find?
Well, what we found is that, yes, absolutely, there are some new innovations and things happening in non-credit training that I'm not sure are exactly understood or documented currently. These are things that have really occurred just within the last couple of years, frankly, with regard to things that are happening at the national policy level through the U.S. Department of Labor or Department of Education, as well as the drivers that community colleges are feeling in order to be able to be market responsive to employers. So absolutely, we did find that non-credit training is absolutely a viable option to address skills and to address employment challenges.
And I think you mentioned in the paper a couple community colleges in particular that you felt like had done some interesting work in this area.
Yeah, and so I have had the opportunity through my consulting business of working with a number of community colleges, and I have a community college background myself. I was vice president out at Salt Lake Community College for 3 years, so I've seen them up close and personal over a number of years. And so we looked at Blue Ridge Community and Technical College in Martinsburg, West Virginia as one example, and I picked them because they have a very unique occurrence going on right now in that labor market, which is Procter & Gamble has been building and it has built partially a large facility out there and had an immediate need for a number of workers with sort of laboratory technician type skills to be able to produce different products that Procter & Gamble makes. And so it really put impetus on Blue Ridge to be able to rapidly be able to train people for occupations that are identified by Procter & Gamble. And in fact, the interesting thing is most of Procter & Gamble's hiring, especially for these mid-level and entry-level positions, and even some of the upper-level positions, are occurring on the Blue Ridge campus. They're actually doing the recruitment through Blue Ridge. So it really presented an opportunity to look at Blue Ridge, kind of do a quick case study and understand what are the things they've learned to be responsive to an employer who says, hey, by the way, we're moving into town, we need 500 workers. And so
Which
that
is a
was
big
one.
deal
It
for
was
any community.
It was, and especially a community the size of Martinsburg, West Virginia,
Yeah.
which is more increasingly a bedroom community of the Washington, D.C. area. Whenever I drive out there, there tends to be traffic going the other way. And so people actually live out in that area and are commuting into either the Dulles corridor or Washington, D.C. But with Procter & Gamble, a lot of people won't need to commute anymore. They can work there, and these are very well-paying jobs. And so in looking at that, we really realized that, importantly, what we learned about Blue Ridge and non-credit, or credit for that matter, because they actually do a combination of both, is that you need to have sort of a culture at a community college that's market responsive, that is connected to employers, that understands what the industry is about, what they're looking for in the jobs, and actually having faculty or teachers who understand both the industry and also a learning environment. That's a big challenge often that a community college will face. And so again, the important part of the Blue Ridge experience was really understanding that culture and what are those things that you need in order to be market responsive. And then that really led us to looking at some other factors in non-credit training, as do those non-credit training factors really meet that cultural condition that Blue Ridge talked about.
So I'm really curious, and we've talked about this in other contexts before, and it's something that you mentioned in your paper as well, but we come from a perspective where we believe in a demand-driven system, that we need to be responsive to employers. But one of the things you bring out in your paper is that employers also have a job to do here to get a better understanding of what it is that community colleges do.
Yes.
So why don't you just share that, because I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, well, I've had a really unique experience in the last couple of years of really coming to understand that we need to have a focus on that is cyclical, a circle, not a straight line. And by that I mean what you said, we say be demand driven. So I often hear community colleges say we need to know what employers need, which to me is a one-way street. It's employer to community college. What I'm finding is that it needs to be a circular feedback loop, that we need to understand, the community colleges need to understand what employers are looking for vis-a-vis competencies and skills and occupational needs. But at the same time, community colleges need to be providing feedback back to the employers around industry recognized credentials, which are kind of a new phenomenon that's occurring. I mean, industry recognized credentials have been around for a long time, but really the focus and connection to non-credit training is fairly recent. In addition, are employers aligning their recruitment and hiring practices to the training and such that's going on at community colleges? What I'm finding is that because of the Great Recession, there was a lot of emphasis on putting a lot of federal dollars to community colleges for workforce training and trying to help build people's skills. And as a result, there's a lot of policy issuances and other things coming out of the U.S. Department of Labor and Department of Education. So community college drivers, so to speak, are from those policy pronouncements coming from the federal government.
Yeah.
Well, what's happening is that while they're trying to be responsive to the federal government, who those federal agencies are working with larger employers and commissions and others who are telling them, these are the ways to be demand-driven and drive community colleges toward that demand-driven vision. What's happening is we're not taking that supply side and engaging the employers and informing them, allowing them to know, hey, this is the kind of programming we're setting up. We're still saying, tell us what you need. We're going to send somebody here. They may have this credential. The employer sees a credential and says, I don't know what this means because it's not even part of my hiring.
So employers are busy people.
They are.
They've got a lot on their plates. They're managing businesses. They're trying to meet payroll. They've got sales and clients and all sorts of things going on. What's the right way for a community college to engage with an employer to try to establish that kind of relationship? Yeah,
well, the first thing is really trying to find the right person at the employment site and on the employer side. Again, another example in West Virginia recently is that I work with a community college there, Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College, very small town, but they have pilgrims that process chickens and do that sort of thing, provide chicken for us all to eat. And they found, I was talking to one of their employees at the college, that it took about 6 or 7 or 8 visits out to the pilgrim site. One, to learn what they were doing, but more importantly, to find the right person who said, yes, I do need to talk to you.
Right.
I do need to connect with you. We do need training. And as a result of finding that right person, Eastern is now literally on site. The Pilgrim's dedicated rooms on site for workers to be able to take time out, say from 3 to 4 in the afternoon to do training on a particular maintenance thing or something they needed to learn, or to become upwardly mobile within the Pilgrim's company. So that was one example. Another one, and one real challenge, I think, for a number of community colleges is they exist in smaller communities all across the United States. And sometimes we think of community colleges, we think of big ones like Northern Virginia Community College or Miami-Dade down in Miami, but the reality is the vast majority of community colleges are very small. They're 1 building, 2, 3 campus locations with a small or mid-sized employer base. Well, my feeling on that is, and what I've seen is that, if you can't engage every single small employer, that's really where employer intermediaries become very important. A local chamber of commerce, finding an advocate through that chamber of commerce, or maybe there's a manufacturing association, or I've seen, for instance, in the healthcare industry, a lot of times a hospital is one of the big employers in a county or in a local area, and you'll get somebody within that hospital who says, yeah, we need help with finding the right skilled workers through a variety of healthcare occupations, and so they'll work with the community college that way. So a lot of it is just being persistent and aggressive and finding the right people within companies or within employer intermediaries who you can engage with and align that training to those skills and competencies that are needed by employers.
Right. And it's to everybody's advantage.
Absolutely.
Yes. The employers are getting what they need, the community colleges and the students, most importantly, getting what they need. You talk a little bit about how educational bureaucracy can be its own impediment to the development of non-credit training programs, or credit or non-credit training programs, but it's easier on the non-credit side. Tell us about why it's easier to set up a non-credit training program than it is to go through the process of creating a fully accredited training program.
Yeah. This is one of the more interesting dynamics that I found, and I think it's really important for us to understand this from a policy perspective. Again, under the assumption that community colleges need to be nimble and quick, and that especially with technological advancements, with changes in work and jobs and what we need for people to be successful on the job, community colleges need to be able to adapt to that very quickly. So I asked the question to a number of community college administrators through surveys and through interviews, how long on the credit side, if an employer says, hey, I need a program today, how long does that take to get that program going? And the answer I received was typically a year to 18 months. And that's because to get a credit program, there's a whole set of requirements, both at the college and even at the state level, to get that approved. So at the college level, you have to, maybe develop the curriculum, get it approved. There's usually curriculum committees at community colleges. They may, depending on the community college, may have to go to the faculty senate, get the VPs and the president to approve. And then once that is all said and done, they have to send it up to the state and go through the state agency, educational agency approval process. And so consistently, from what I've seen, from the feedback I've received, now this is different state to state, but in a number of states, it can take up to a year, and that's way too long.
Yeah.
Versus
in a just-in-time economy,
you can't take that long.
And with technology changing so quickly, that's just a non-starter, I would think.
Absolutely. So if you have an established, say, associate degree program that's workforce focused, or maybe especially in healthcare where you've got more licensing type of requirements due to safety, occupational safety, and people's health and things like that. A non-credit program may not always be the most viable option because you've got those requirements that take time in order to take those courses, and you need to have. But if it's manufacturing or a number of these other construction or a number of these other type of industries, you don't need those kind of bureaucratic licensing, time-based. It's competency-based training is what you need, not time-based. And so non-credit.
I'd like to pause you right there and just describe the difference between time-based and competency-based.
Okay.
I think that's an important point.
Yeah, so this is another component of the paper that we discuss, and that is that time-based means that, you've heard the term seat time often. So if I take a 3-hour credit class in a college or a university, that means that I have a certain amount of time that I have to take, and of course they test and other kinds of things, finals week and all that fun stuff. But it's a time base. It doesn't necessarily, I show competency by the amount of time I spend in the class and then passing tests, so to speak. Competency based means you may take 3 weeks, I may take 5 weeks to learn and be able to master the same competency, but because you can do it in 3 weeks, you move on. You show demonstration of mastery of that competency. And you will move on to the next one.
And non-credit is for that competency-based
That's absolutely correct. Non-credit is much more applicable to a competency-based system, which is really from, again, a market responsiveness, what you need. Sometimes, I've seen through the paper and through other work that a lot of times employers are saying, just give me somebody that can operate machine A. Well, I don't necessarily need 12 weeks to learn how to operate machine A. It might take me 3, but it depends on the person. And then how you show the mastery of that competency is typically through testing, and a lot of times that's applied testing. A college may have that actual machine on site, or sometimes even at the employer site, and they can show mastery of that competency on the machine. Once you do, boom, I'm moving on, or I'm getting a job because I've shown mastery. I don't have to sit in class for another 12 weeks because it's a time-based system.
Right.
So non-credit really is more adept at that, and flexible at that competency-based notion. And again, one of the other colleges we looked at in the paper was Polk State College down in Florida, where they have a very focused effort at working with employers and getting non-credit programs up and running. And again, the thing I found in interviewing and looking at that college is that, at their corporate college within Polk State, is that it's really based on the employer, is how long it takes to get a program up and running. It's not the 12 to 18 months. It's, okay, identify what competencies you need, how do people demonstrate those competencies, and what does performance success look like once you know what the competencies, in other words, I can do the job, what does doing a good job look like? And then also looking at, how do we pay for that? Employer, are you gonna pay for that through a contract? Or are we gonna find a grant, or that sort of thing? And the thing's up and running within 4 weeks, the program.
And that goes to actually the question I wanted just to wrap up on, because huge issue in all kinds of education, post-secondary education these days, is how do we pay for it? And I thought you had some really interesting observations about both innovative approaches that are currently being done at the state level, or in a community college, at the community college level, and then some recommendations around some changes that we need at the federal level. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit too.
Yes, well, first off, I would say, as a general statement, that there's a bias against non-credit workforce training through federal funding sources. By that I mean, you look at Pell Grant. Pell Grants typically works for credit students, or the traditional university or transfer student at a community college, but doesn't really work for that non-credit student unless they take a certain amount of what are called clock hours, which can be converted to credit. But unless you take a few hundred clock hours, which again, a lot of these courses or a lot of these programs, you may not need that much, you're not eligible for Pell Grant dollars. So right away, one of the main sources of post-secondary funding for individuals is not available for these students. So because of the bias in federal funding toward credit students and rather than non-credit students, states, for instance, are picking up and filling that gap. One state, again, using an example, is West Virginia, that has the Higher Education Adult Part-Time Student Program, or HEAPS for short. They provide up to $2,000 for a student to take non-credit workforce training that leads to employment. So that is things states are having to do to sort of fill that gap due to the federal funding bias against non-credit training. The second thing, and the big player in this obviously, are employers as well. And employers are either as a single employer or as an industry, often in local labor markets, working with community colleges through contracts and other means. Maybe it's an apprenticeship program where they're providing the costs of training to help boost people's skills. The one thing I did notice philosophically that most community college folks told me is that their goal often is, because they're working with students who are unemployed or underemployed or low-wage workers. As a result, they don't have their own financial means necessarily to get the skills training they need. And so what I see often is that community colleges are doing everything they can to piece together funding, whether it's employers or state funding or maybe even federal funding, to be able to provide a no-cost to student opportunity, realizing that really resources are constrained by the individual himself or herself.
And employers are interested in this because it's important for their bottom line, to have a workforce that is well-trained and, it's skilled in what they need, and that's why they invest in these things.
Absolutely, yeah. And really, and when we talk about skills, we don't spend a lot of time talking about particular types of skills in the paper, but really skills, again, I'll speak in broad terms here, take on one or two themes. One is hard skills, or the skills I need to be able to perform in an occupation. But the other part of this really are you could call them employability skills, but I would get a little more focused than just that broad term. I think it's the ability to combine technical skills with things such as analysis, troubleshooting, the ability to perceive, fix what needs to be fixed, and be able on the fly be able to fix it and analyze. And the combination of those skills are really what a lot of community colleges are having to do through their non-credit training programs, is how do I merge sort of the notion of what employers need with technical skills with some of those employability analysis skills, and be able to connect those and weave those together in a way that provides a good worker for an employer.
And those skills that you're talking about, those employability skills, soft skills, non-cognitive skills, those are the things that allow people to learn on the job once they've got the job. If
Correct.
you are able to analyze the problem and think on your feet, those kinds of skills allow you to keep your job and advance in your job.
Right.
So very, very important.
Well, that provides one sort of last piece to this puzzle, and that's the idea of industry recognized credentials, which I talk about in the paper, because I think this is a really important phenomenon that's happening right now, which is industry recognized credentials are defined as those third-party credentials that are portable, that are provided by national industry associations or other types of organizations that represent an industry, and they really are the connection between the training somebody gets and the job. So that's when we say we need to be educating employers. Employers need to know what those industry recognized credentials are.
Sure.
One interesting component to that with regard to the connection between technical skills and non-cognitive skills is that I actually did a paper that I reference in the non-credit paper, that out in Kansas, I looked at whether a particular industry recognized credential was being utilized by employers out there. And one of the interesting findings of that was that while employers didn't always understand what that industry recognized credential meant, because somebody had completed something, it was a marker for, or symbolic for, this person may have some level of persistence on the job, and it spoke to those non-cognitive skills as well. So that's another interesting part of this non-credit paper that I've just written, is that the use of industry recognized credentials have a number of positive impacts, I think, ultimately. One is they provide that bridge between non-credit training and the employer hiring and recruitment competencies, but just as importantly, may indicate to the employer that the person is persistent, can complete, can finish a job, and maybe has some of those other skills and other aptitudes that an employer needs for somebody to be successful on the job.
That's great. Well, Mason, thank you so much for coming in today to
My
talk
pleasure.
to us. We're very excited about the paper, and looking forward to getting that paper out, as well as this conversation for people to hear more about it.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
Thank you, AEI.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Mason Bishop. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about workforce development, check the links in the description below.